Do you be goat? Do you be goat? Do you be goat? Do you be fish? Do you be goat? Because the goats do be goat and the fish do be fish. Do you be goat or a fish? Don't sit on the fence. Well, goat are of the land and fish are of the sea. But goat versus fish, which one do you be? Do you be goat or a fish? Do you be goat or a fish? Because the goats do be goat and the fish do be fish. Do you be goat or a fish? Don't sit on the fence. Now repeat, repeat after goat versus fish. Doobie 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 goat, doobie goat, doobie goat, or doobie fish and doobie goat or a fish. Because the goats do be goat and the fish do be fish. Do you be goat or a fish? Don't sit on the fence. Well, goat versus fish came up to me and said, a goat or a fish, which one do you be? Do you be goat or a fish? 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 Because the goats do be goat and the fish do be fish. Do you be goat or a fish? Don't sit on the fence. Because the goats do be goat and the fish do be fish. The medieval fence sitter sits on the fence. But the goats do be goat and the fish do be fish. Do you be goat or a fish? Do you be goat? Do you be goat? Do you be goat? Do you be goat? Do you be fish? Do you be fish? Do you be fish? Do you be goat? Do you be goat? Or do you be fish? Because the goats do be goat and the fish do be fish. Do you be goat or a fish? Don't sit on the fence. Well, goat are of the land and fish are of the sea. But goat versus fish, which one do you be? Do you be goat or a fish? Do you be goat or a fish? Because the goats do be goat and the fish do be fish. Do you be goat or a fish? Don't sit on the fence. Now repeat, repeat after goat versus fish. Doobie 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 goat, doobie goat, doobie goat, doobie goat, or doobie fish. fish? Do be fish, a do be goat or a fish? Because the goat do be goat and the fish do be fish. Do you be goat or a fish? Don't sit on the fence. Well, goat versus fish came up to me and said, a goat or a fish, which one do you be? Do you be goat or a fish? 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 Because the goat do be goat and the fish do be fish. Do you be goat or a fish? Don't sit on the fence. Because the goat do be goat and the fish do be fish, the beautiful man sitter sits on the fence. But the goat do be goat and the fish do be fish. Do you be goat or a fish? Do you be goat? Do you be goat? Do you be goat? Do you be goat? Do you be fish? Do you be fish? Do you be fish? Do you be goat? Do you be goat or do you be fish? Because the goats do be goat and the fish do be fish. Do you be goat or a fish? Don't sit on the fence. Well, goat are of the land and fish are of the sea. But goat versus fish, which one do you be? Do you be goat or a fish? Meh. Do you be goat or a fish? Because the goat do be goat and the fish do be fish. Do you be goat or a fish? Don't sit on the fence. Now repeat, repeat after goat versus fish. Doobie 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 a doobie goat, doobie goat, doobie goat, doobie goat, or doobie fish, doobie fish, a doobie goat or a fish, because the goat doobie goat and the fish doobie fish. Do you be goat or a fish? Don't sit on the fence. Well, goat versus fish came up to me and said, a goat or a fish, which one do you be? Do you be goat or a fish? 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 Because the goat do be goat and the fish do be fish. Do you be goat or a fish? Don't sit on the fence. Because the goat do be goat and the fish do be fish, the beautiful man sitter sits on the fence.
Goat and fish. Goat and fish.
But the goat do be goat and the fish do be fish. Do you be goat or a fish?
Goat and fish.
Do you be goat?
Do you be goat or do you be fish? Goat and fish. Noodalicious, welcome to Goat vs. Fish. Noodalicious, welcome to Goat vs. Fish. Welcome to Goat vs. Fish. Goat and Fish, we have a special versus. A very special versus. Coming to you now on Goat vs. Fish. Work in 1984 with a subscription to Goat vs. Fish. Goat vs. Fish, we have a very special versus in the verses of Goat vs. Fish because Goat vs. Fish has taken on even more beautiful, powerful forms of Goat vs. Fish. More beautiful and glorious forms of Goat vs. Fish. This verses will astound, this verses will expound, this verses will make you say, wow, it's Goat vs. Fish. We just have to get the verses. Ah, yes, Goat vs. Fish. Ah, it's Goat vs. Fish. Oh, Goat vs. Fish. So why in the fence? Goat vs. Fish. Goat vs. Fish, Goat vs. Fish, Goat vs. Fish, Goat vs. Fish. Ah, so that verses, and then the pre-verses of Goat vs. Fish. The pre-verses of Goat vs. Fish. Goat vs. Fish. Oh, just wait a verses. Just wait a verses. We're totally getting to the amazing, exciting verses of Goat vs. Fish that you have been versing for. We're totally getting to that verses. We just have to do a little celebration of Goat vs. Fish. Just a little celebration of Goat vs. Fish. Just a little celebration of Goat vs. Fish, and then we do that verses, and then we do this verses. Goat vs. Fish. What the fence? What the fence? So the verse, Goat vs. Fish, we have to do this verses, and then Goat vs. Fish. Okay, that's a verses. That's a verses of Goat vs. Fish. That seems like a verses of Goat vs. Fish. Ah, because Goat vs. Fish. Goat vs. Fish. Goat vs. Fish is here to bring you an exciting verses of Goat vs. Fish. An exciting verses of Goat vs. Fish, the verses of which has scarcely been beheld on Goat vs. Fish. And now, Goat vs. Fish will make a verses for this verses of Goat vs. Fish, for this verses of Goat vs. Fish. Prepare to be beholding what is the celebration of the new and mighty powerful Goat vs. Fish. Goat and Fish, behold the power of Goat versus Fish. Behold the power of Goat versus Fish. Look at the verses. Look at the beauty of Goat versus Fish. Look at the beauty of Goat versus Fish. Let's just move about. Let's just move about and show them the beauty and power of Goat versus Fish. Look at these verses. Ooh. Goat versus Fish. Goat versus Fish, emanating with the power of Goat versus Fish, emanating with the power of Goat versus Fish, yes. Ooh, Goat versus Fish. Look at this verses, look at this amazing verses, Goat versus Fish. Not so strong are the fence sitters. They do not have the brilliance of Goat versus Fish. They do not have the amazing power of Goat versus Fish. But Goat versus Fish has the power of Goat versus Fish. Goat versus Fish, Justin freaking. Look at Goat versus Fish. Look at the glory of Goat versus Fish. Look at the glory of Goat versus Fish. Such an amazing verses, such an amazing verses. Now they will look at Goat versus Fish. Now they will all look at Goat versus Fish. And they will see that Goat versus Fish is not a versus to be trifled with, no. No! Connie Cryptic, welcome to Goat vs. Fish. Welcome to Goat vs. Fish, Goat King. Who are you voting for in the election, goat or fish? An excellent versus Siomancy 6. Goat, Connie Cryptic, goat, Connie Cryptic, goat. Connie Cryptic, goat. Connie Cryptic, goat. Look at all those goat, look at all those goat. Look at all those goat in the verses. Look at all those goat in the verses, goat and fish. It just totally says goat. It totally says goat. Goat, 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 goat. Celebration for goat. Justin Freakin says goat versus fish. Justin Freakin says goat versus fish. Freakin versus. Freakin versus. Freakin versus of goat versus fish. And a fence sitter and a fence sitter. A pitiable fence creature. A pitiable fence creature. Fancy, fancy fence creature. Pitiable fence creature. Goat versus fish, it's time we count the verses. Let's count the verses. Tyrus with a fish blob, celebration for fish. Celebration for fish. Celebration for fish. Fish, 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 fish. Fish, 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 fish. And Tyrus with 200 bits, and Tyrus will never tire us with 200 bits. Celebration, celebration. 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 These 200 bits of Tyrus will be added to fish, for the glory of goat versus fish, for the glory of fish. Will be added to goat versus fish for the glory of fish after these verses are wiped clean. For goat versus fish begins anew, for goat versus fish begins anew. Connie Cryptic. How do you versus the fish? 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 Goat and fish in the verses now. We have Emily Schultz, the fish. Celebration for fish. Celebration for fish. Connie Cryptic. Going for the horn, going for the horn. Horn in the fish, horn in the fish. Connie Cryptic going for horn in the fish. Horning 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 the fish. The fish was horned. The fish was horned. Working with the gifted verses. We thought we changed that verses. Oh no, we left that verses. Celebration. Celebration. Working 1984 with the gifted verses. Working with the gifted verses. We're working here. Goat versus fish is working here. Goat versus fish is working here. And yes, we are still in a mighty unification of goat and fish. A mighty unification of goat and fish. And it's a celebration, and it's a celebration. And it's a celebration. And it's a celebration of goat versus fish. Tyrus with 200 bits, with 200 bits for fish, with 200 bits for the fish. That's 200 verse points for fish. That's 200 verse points for fish. Working 1884. Are you goat or are you fish? That looks like a subscription. A subscription for unification. A subscription for unification. A subscription for unification. A subscription for unification. That's one unification subscription from Workin 1984. And Tyrus with another 25 bits for fish, with another 25 bits for fish. Celebration for fish, celebration for fish. The poll has begun on goat versus fish. The poll has begun on goat versus fish. Working with the gifted verses, working with the gifted verses, but working also with the subscription to goat versus fish. We do not know why it's not giving us notification on that verses. But it says working with a subscription to goat versus fish. So we're going to count that. for another versus. We're going to count that subscription for fish. 1 gifted versus for unification, and 1 for the fish. I like the colorful shadow that flows with your verses. What would that look like while juggling? We would have to find that out on Goat vs. Fish, but yes. Yes, Goat and Fish. Yes, Goat and Fish. It's a beautiful new verses. Behold! Behold the beautiful new verses of Goat vs. Fish. Behold the beautiful verses of Goat vs. Fish. Yes! Yes, Goat vs. Fish. Stream improvements on Goat vs. Fish. What's happening on Goat vs. Fish? Suddenly, Goat vs. Fish. Streamer upgrade. Wow, serious verses. Wow, serious verses. Notice, Goat and Fish, how the trails on Goat vs. Fish, they grow larger and smaller and larger and smaller. Yes, they grow larger and smaller, but so too does the coloration of Goat vs. Fish change from verses to verses. There is so much happening on Goat vs. Fish, so much happening on Goat vs. Fish. Unhinged Granny, welcome to Goat vs. Fish. Unhinged Granny, are you goat or are you fish? Goat vs. Fish, here to cheer you up, here to cheer you up. And you're here to cheer up Goat vs. Fish. Unhinged Granny, are you goat or are you fish? Are you goat or are you fish? Connie Cryptic the goat. Connie Cryptic the goat. Celebration for goat. Connie Cryptic the goat. Celebration for goat. Wow, Mom the goat is in the verses. Wow, Mom the goat is in the verses. Unhinged Granny is goat. Let's goat. Unhinged Granny goat. Old goat. Old goat. Unhinged Granny, old goat indeed. Old goat indeed. Celebration for goat. Goat for me. Inventive harvest goat. Celebration for goat. Celebration for goat. Inventive harvest. Celebration for goat. Celebration. Beautiful verses. Justin Freakin, are you goat or are you fish? Connie Cryptic. Connie Cryptic has stabbed the fish with goat horns. Fish. How do you versus the goat? Fish. Are there any fish in chat that would versus this goat? Though we have entered the verses in unification, goat Connie Cryptic has stabbed the fish with its goat horns. How does fish return verses? How does fish return verses? Sciomancy 6 goes goat. Sciomancy 6 goes goat. It's looking like a strong versus for goat. It's looking like a strong versus for goat here on Goat vs. Fish. New Delicious, are you goat or are you fish? And Sunnyvale representation, the first goat of the verses, the first goat of the verses. Celebration for goat. Celebration for goat. Celebration for goat. Now, Goat and Fish, we have had a poll on Goat vs. Fish. We just had a poll on Goat vs. Fish. And let's find out what happened on the Goat vs. Fish. Let's find out what happened in the poll of Goat vs. Fish. Let's view the verses. Let's view the verses. Goat vs. Fish. Goat vs. Fish. Are we getting a standing chalkboard? Are we getting a standing chalkboard? Well, interesting you should say that to Goat vs. Fish. Interesting you should say that to Goat vs. Fish. The standing chalkboard, we have 174.93 versus American dollars towards the contribution of the standing chalkboard of Goat vs. Fish. Exclamation tip to fund the standing chalkboard of Goat vs. Fish. And then Goat vs. Fish will have a verses. And then we can make it written here that it is Goat vs. Fish. And then we can flip the verses and we can flip the verses. And it will be a celebration. It will be a great celebration. Goat vs. Fish foresees. Goat vs. Fish foresees a standing chalkboard in the future of Goat vs. Fish, in the future of Goat vs. Fish, but only if you believe in Goat vs. Fish. Only if you believe in Goat vs. Fish. Only if you believe in Goat vs. Fish. But while we are waiting for the belief in Goat vs. Fish, for the freestanding chalkboard of Goat vs. Fish, we are also becoming all the more powerful. Ooh, powerful verses. Powerful verses. Ooh. Amazing, powerful verses. Celebration. 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 Dumpster Fire Games. Are you goat or are you fish? Tyrus is continuing a gifted verses. Tyrus with the continued gifted verses. Tyrus with the continuing the gifted verses. The greatest gift of Goat vs. Fish is to continue Goat vs. Fish. Tyrus received a gifted verses and Tyrus continues the verses. That's a subscription for fish. That's a subscription for fish. And we don't know why we are not getting subscription notification on Goat vs. Fish. What the fence is going on? Celebration. Celebration for Tyrus. Celebration for Tyrus. Work in 1984. Celebration for Tyrus. Tyrus the fish. Tyrus the fish. Tyrus the fish. We're going to take a brief look at that versus. Unhinged Granny Fish, Unhinged Granny, are you going fish? Unhinged Granny, are you goat or are you fish? And Connie Cryptic has stabbed the fish with goat horns and the fish have not made any retaliation whatsoever. Is there a fish in chat who would versus the goat? Celebración por todos los cabras y peces. Unhinged Granny Goat, Unhinged Granny Goat. That's what we thought. We thought it was an unhinged Granny Goat. We thought it was an old goat. We were so certain it was an old goat. So certain it was an old goat. Goat and Fish, Goat versus Fish is also making some changes behind the verses. Things that you cannot see, which will add to the efficiency of Goat versus Fish. And Unification has won. Unification has won the pre-versus poll. Unification has won the pre-versus poll, Goat and Fish. We've got a Unification, and the Unification is already there in the pre-versus poll. Celebration. Celebration for Unification. Celebration for Unification. Amazing verses, amazing verses. Goat and Fish, we have been in Unification for four verses, and the Unification may continue. Emily Schultz, Fish. Celebration for Fish. Celebration for Fish. Celebration for Fish. Celebration for Fish. Let's go into the camera of Goat versus Fish. Let's go into the camera of Goat versus Fish. You couldn't hear Goat versus Fish. We suspect you couldn't hear Goat versus Fish. Yes, go. Do not despair. Do not despair. Do not despair. Goat versus Fish knows how to do the verses. Some verses of Goat versus Fish. Just give us the verses of Goat versus Fish, and we'll get you the verses. We'll get you the verses of Goat versus Fish. We'll get you the verses of Goat versus Fish. We'll get you the verses of Goat versus Fish. We'll get you the verses of Goat versus Fish. Goat and Fish and 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 by the power of Goat versus Fish. Celebration, celebration. Now you can hear Goat versus Fish. Now you can hear Goat versus Fish. Now you can hear Goat versus Fish. Do we know, when speaking of the two presidential candidates, which of Goat and which is Fish? Do we know which is Goat and which is Fish? We would love to know if which is Goat and which is Fish, but we can tell you one versus that we know for certain. And that is, one of them has long promised to build a fence across Fence America.
They damaged the fence. You know, the fence wasn't too good. The one that they had up there was falling apart. The fence in front of the White House, excuse me, that I built it.
The fence builder wants to build the fence to divide Goat from Fish, to divide Goat from Fish. To divide Goat from Fish. False verses, false verses. Are you Goat or are you Fish? Donald Harris, are you Goat or Fish? Kamala Trump, are you Goat or are you Fish? Tell Goat versus Fish. Tell Goat versus Fish. So here we are in the verses. Artman, are you Goat or are you Fish? So here we're looking at this verses, and let's go to this verses. Let's go to this verses, and let's somewhat embiggen this verses celebration. Somewhat embiggen that verses. And then Goat versus Fish. Let's go to Goat versus Fish. Shall we sharpen, ever so slightly sharpen this verses? Let's sharpen this verses by one verses. So Goat and Fish, so Goat and Fish. Let's have a look at the settings of Goat versus Fish. Let's have a look at the settings of Goat versus Fish. Count Fensula, Count Fensula. Fancy, sounds very fancy. Let's have a look at these verses of Goat versus Fish. Let's have a look at these verses of Goat versus Fish. You may say, Goat versus Fish, how has this happened on Goat versus Fish? Wasted space, celebration for Goat. Celebration for goat. Well, let us show you the verse. Let us show you the verses, goat and fish. Let us show you the verses. Let us show you the verses. As you can see, goat and fish, it's a big verses. It's a very big verses, a verses of complication. Look at that verses. Look at that verses. Look at all the automation happening on goat versus fish. You can observe it. You can observation the coloration shifting between goat versus fish, shifting between goat versus fish. You can look at the verses shifting between goat versus fish, shifting between goat and fish and goat and fish and all the verses. And you can see the aura of goat versus fish growing and shrinking on goat versus fish, growing and shrinking on goat versus fish as we cycle through the coloration, Amazing verses, goat and fish. Powerful verses of goat versus fish. We have achieved great things on goat versus fish, and we shall achieve more because you deserve verses, a very special verses of goat versus fish. A very special verses of goat versus fish, and we're here to give it to you. The verses that are true, the verses that are true. Celebration for goat versus fish. Oh, whoa, goat versus, what the fence? What the fence in goat versus fish? What the fence just happened on goat versus fish? Scary goat. Amy Canna with 24 for goat versus fish, with 24 for goat versus fish. That was a double creepy goat. Double creepy goat. J-Sticks, are you goat or are you fish? J-Sticks, are you goat or fish? So we have one versus. Can we please remove that previous verses? We don't need double creepy goat. 24 for goat, 24 bits for goat. That's 24 bits for goat from Amy Canna. Can I get a goat? Can I get a goat? Can I get a goat? Can I get a goat in the verses? Can I get a goat in the verses? J-Sticks, are you goat or are you fish? J-Sticks, are you goat or are you fish? Appreciation for 24 bits for 24 bits for goat for 24 bits for goat. And Unification. Unification won the poll in the pre-verses. Unification won the pre-verses poll. Unification won the pre-verses poll. Goat and fish. The uncanny valley is between Goat Mountain. Oh, but wait a verses. The pre-verses poll wasn't giving a first poll to Unification. The pre-verses poll was giving 1,000 verse points lead for Unification. So we have 225 for fish, and we have 1,000 verse points. 1,000 verse points for Unification. That's what's happening on goat versus fish. That's what's happening on goat versus fish. That's what's happening on goat versus fish. Baconopia, it is pleasant to have you back on goat versus fish. A salty and savory versus such as yourself, a smoky versus is always welcome on goat versus fish. Is always welcome on goat versus fish. Celebration. Goat versus fish. Goat and fish. The J-Sticks goes fish. J-Sticks goes fish. Celebration for fish. Celebration for fish. Celebration for fish. We have learned so much. We have learned so much about goat versus fish. For a versus, goat and fish, we have done some programification. Let's see what we can get here on goat versus fish. At the touch of a versus. Critical verses. At the touch of a verses. Critical verses for goat versus fish. At the touch of a verses. At the touch of a verses. Amy Canna with 24 bits. Celebration, celebration, celebration. At the touch of a verses.
Goat versus fish.
At the touch of a verses, at the touch of a verses. At the touch of a verses, celebration at the touch of a verses. And this should be, well, that's that verses, but this verses. Why the fence is that not happening on goat versus fish? Why the fence is that not happening on goat versus fish? That should happen on goat versus fish. Do not despair, goat versus fish. We're versing on that, we're versing on that. Are you goat or are you fish?
Goat or fish! Goat or fish! Goat or fish!
So Goat versus Fish, we have these verses, ready to verses. We have learned more about scene organization in OBVS, the obvious verses of Goat versus Fish. And yesterverses, there was not a stream of Goat versus Fish, but that's because we were working on this amazing technologification of Goat versus Fish so that you can enjoy even more colorful Goat versus Fish, even more colorful Goat versus Fish. Goat or fish. So let's get the verses going on Goat versus Fish. Let's get the verses going on Goat versus Fish. Another poll on Goat versus Fish. This versus counts for a poll of Goat versus Fish. Counts for a poll of Goat versus Fish. Are you goat or fish? Are you goat or fish? And let's make the verses. Let's make the verses. Artman, are you goat or fish? Are you goat or are you fish? Artman, you who would interview others and ask them questions. Are you goat or fish? The verses comes to you. Are you goat or fish? 10 channel points per vote, 10 channel points per vote, and the poll has begun, goat and fish. The poll is live. Are you goat or are you fish? Goat and fish. Are you goat or are you fish? Are you goat or are you fish? Are you goat or are you fish now? 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 4 votes for goat, 4 votes for goat, 4 votes for the goat. Get into that versus, get into that versus. Goat versus Fish has a show this versus in Los Angeles, but we wanted to give you a little stream of Goat versus Fish, give you a little stream of Goat versus Fish, just like this. And why don't we play some musications? Why don't we play some musications on Goat versus Fish? Why don't we get ready to play some musications on Goat versus Fish, just for the sake of verses? Just for the sake of verses. As the poll rages on with 20 for unification. With 20 for unification. With 20 for unification. 26 for goat, 26 for goat. 26 for goat. 50 for goat, 50 for goat, 29 for fish, 29 for fish. The output of Goat versus Fish, the output of Goat versus Fish. The output of Goat versus Fish. The output of Goat versus Fish. And do not despair, the kickers may be saying, where's my poll, Goat versus Fish? Where's my poll, Goat versus Fish? Do not despair once we get 5 Goat and Fish active in the kick chat of Goat versus Fish. You'll see your polls on Goat versus Fish. You'll see your polls on Goat versus Fish. You'll see your polls on Goat versus Fish. You'll see your verses. You'll get your verses. John Daggy, welcome, celebration. Fish, Rain F goes fish. Rain F says fish, celebration for fish. Rain F says fish, celebration for fish. Rain F fish, Rain F fish, Rain F fish, fish. How do you versus the goat? 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 John Daggy, how do you versus? Are you goat or are you fish? Are you goat or fish? Are you goat or fish? We must note if you're goat or fish. Radiator Ice, welcome to Goat versus Fish. Radiator Ice, welcome to Goat versus Fish. Radiator Ice, welcome to Goat versus Fish. A beautiful verses. Hello, great streamer. Wow. Maybe not thank you for following Goat versus Fish. Hello, great streamer. Wow, it sounds like Goat versus Fish is just spam, but I am what I am. Great streamer. Wow, we receive notifications like this in our text every verses. Oh, hello, current resident great streamer. I couldn't help but watching your verses. And I couldn't see that you're not partnered. I've got a proposal for you. I will share for your stream to our community with 1,000 million verses. Oh, my Goat versus Fish. Wow. Are you interested? Why don't you go fence yourself with a nice ban on Goat versus Fish. Banned by Goat versus Fish. Celebration. Rain F says, I fish the fence. You fish the fence with the large splashes of water. Rain F who splashes the fence. Rain F splashes the fence. Ha! Wet fence, wet soggy fence. Wet soggy fence. Oh, my verses. Wet, soggy fence. So my verse is, are you goat or fish? 94 for goat. 94 for goat. 138 for unification. The Blog TV guest, what if you were born a fish but identify with goat? There is only one question, the Blog TV guest. Are you goat or are you fish? That's the verses. Are you goat or are you fish? That's the whole verses. Goat, celebration for goat, celebration for goat. Celebration for goat, celebration for goat, 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 goat. Celebration for goat, celebration for goat, celebration for goat, celebration for goat, and then goat versus fish. We need goat versus fish. We need the verses. We need the verses. We need the verses of goat versus fish. We need the tuner fish of goat versus fish. We need the tuner fish of goat versus fish. But it's all here on goat versus fish. It's all here on goat versus fish. We know where we can get the verses. We have preparation. We have achieved something approaching basic preparation on goat versus fish. And it is a celebration, and it is a celebration. It is a celebration of basic preparation on goat versus fish. Celebration! 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 Goat versus fish. Celebration! Celebration! Let's turn up that verses. Let's turn up that verses. Goat versus fish. Goat versus fish. Goat versus fish. And fish coming into the verses now with 267 for fish, with 267 for fish. 267 for fish, 269 for fish. Fish will not have unification. This verse is not this versus goat. Not this versus goat. The Musications of Pandemonium Big Band have been a celebration, but we think it's time for celebration! Celebration! Mighty verses! Goat versus fish. Goat versus fish. Goat versus fish is goat versus fish. And it is what it is. Goat versus fish, the mighty goat fish. Goat versus fish is a goat and a fish. And the goat and fish versus goat versus fish brings the verses to you. verses we tell you are true. What's goat versus fish? You haven't a clue. But it is something to do. It is something to do, and it comes from within you. Goat versus fish. Celebration for goat, celebration for goat. Celebration for fish. Celebration for fish. Celebration for fish. Goat are always versus the fish. Celebration for fish are always versus the goat. And it was written, and it was wrote, that goat versus fish and fish versus goat. If that doesn't make any sense, just please don't sit on the fence. No, don't sit on the fence. Goat versus fish. Goat versus fish is live on the stream. What does that even mean? Hobbit 9000. Are you goat or fish? Goat versus fish. Goat versus fish is live on the stream. Hobbit 9000 fish. Some say goat versus fish is a sham. Some say goat versus fish is a scam. Some say goat versus fish is just spam. But what can I tell you? I am what I am. It's not dolphin versus lamb. No, it's goat versus fish for as long as you wish, and it's live on the stage, and it's all of the rage, and it was just seen on NBC on season 19 of AGT, and also on a little versus called Kill Tony. Goat versus fish is a thing that we say, like how do you do or have a nice day. It's the games that we play. Goat versus fish is a beautiful song. There is no good or evil, there's no right or wrong. But that fence sure is long. For goat versus fish for as long as you wish. It's goat versus fish. And the unity of goat fish. Celebration, celebration for the musication of goat versus fish. Julie Mr. Humdinger comes into the verses with fish. Julie Mr. Humdinger comes into the verses with fish. Celebration for fish, and fish have won the poll. Goat and fish have won the poll. And we've got Julie Mr. Humdinger with the fish, Julie Mr. Humdinger with the fish, and fish has won the poll. Goat and fish, a poll for fish, a poll for fish, a poll for the fish. J6 fish, 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 fish. Julie Mr. Humdinger, what do you think of this verses? Julie Mr. Humdinger, look at goat versus fish. Look at goat versus fish. Look at this amazing verses. It's Goat versus Fish Thursday. Look at this amazing verses. Look at how colorful is Goat versus Fish. Look at how amazing is Goat versus Fish. Yes, we love the verses. Do you be goats? 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 Do you be goat? Do you be fish? Do you be fish? Do you be fish? Do you be goats? Do you be goat? Or do you be fish? Because the goats do be goat and the fish do be fish. Do you be goat or a fish? Don't sit on the fence. Well, goats are of the land and fish are of the sea. About what kind of goat or fish do you be? Do you be goat or a fish? Do you be goat or a fish? Because the goats do be goat and the fish do be fish. Do you be goat or a fish? Don't sit on the fence. Repeat after goat versus fish. Doobie 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 doobie. Doobie 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 doobie. Doobie 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 doobie. Oh, my verses, that's a bit. That's the verses. Doobie 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 doobie. A doobie 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 doobie. A doobie goat, doobie goat, doobie goat, doobie goat, or doobie fish, doobie fish, doobie goat, or a fish, because the goat doobie goat and the fish doobie fish. Do you be goat or a fish? Don't sit on the fence. Well, goat versus fish came up to me and said, a goat or a fish, which one do you be? Do you be goat or a fish? 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 Because the goat do be goat and the fish do be fish. Do you be goat or a fish? Don't sit on the fence. Because the goat do be goat and the fish do be fish. The pitiable fence sitter sits on the fence. But the goat do be goat and the fish do be fish. Do you be goat or a fish? Celebration for Goat versus Fish. Impressive shredding, says Scott from Canada. Impressive shredding, says Scott from Canada. A psychedelic this versus. We think it's going to be a psychedelic versus this versus pretty much every versus from now until Goat versus Fish. Why did the critical versus just happen on Goat versus Fish? We don't mind a critical versus, it's just, do not despair. Goat vs. Fish is in the middle of versing up OBS, so it is even more powerful for Goat vs. Fish, and that includes this amazing colorfulation of Goat vs. Fish, this amazing colorfulation of Goat vs. Fish. Did you hear that Venice Film is going to Skiptown Playhouse? Oh, celebration! Goat vs. Fish should go to that versus. Send an invitation to Goat vs. Fish. Goat vs. Fish. That's a beautiful verses. Why not double the verses? Why not double the verses of coloration? Goat versus the fish, goat versus fish, fish versus the goat. Are you goat or fish? The goat versus fish, goat versus fish, goat versus fish, fish versus goat, fish versus goat, goat versus fish. Goat versus fish, fish versus goat, fish versus goat, for the goat and the fish, and the fish and the goat. Goat versus fish, goat versus fish, fish versus goat. Goat versus fish, goat versus fish, fish versus goat, fish versus goat, goat versus fish, goat versus fish, fish versus goat, fish versus goat. Well, the goat and the fish, and the fish and the goat. Goat versus fish, and fish versus goat. Nice celebration, goat versus fish. Time to put away the axe of goat versus fish. Goat versus fish, maybe that's how we should refer to this versus. Goat versus fish has wondered about this amplification, musication system of goat versus fish. Is it a goatar? Is it a bass? But we have also heard it called an axe. We have also heard it called an axe, and we have also heard it said that goat versus fish can axe you a question. We have heard that in some verses. We ask the question in goat versus fish, and in other verses, we axe the question of goat versus fish. We have heard these verses out in the comedy places. Much too much celebration. Like they say, we don't remember because there is no black or white, there's only goat and fish. But some verses, they say like, well, the goats say, I want to ask you a question, but the fish say, I want to axe you a question. Or maybe it's the reverses. Maybe it's the goat who asks the questions and the fish who asks the questions. But goat versus fish, with the help of this axe, goat versus fish can axe you the question, are you goat or are you fish, with much amplification. So we'll call it the axe of goat versus fish, because we're axing you, are you goat or are you fish? Are you goat or are you fish? With the axe of goat versus fish. Celebration, celebration, celebration. J-Stick says the reverse is probably, it could be the reverse, or it could be the reverse of the reverse. Have you ever thought that maybe it's the reverse of the reverse? To reverse the verses again? If it's really the reverse, then maybe it's the reverse of the reverse. Or maybe we just have to reverse the whole verses. Maybe we have to just reverse the whole verses. Maybe we just have to reverse the whole verses. Because when we reverse the verses, it's more goat versus fish. It's more goat versus fish. And who doesn't love more goat versus fish? Who doesn't love more goat versus fish? Celebration. Scott from Canada, are you goat or are you fish? Are you goat or are you fish? Luke Duke, 1776, is goat. Celebration for goat. Celebration for goat. Rain F has splashed the fence. Do any of you fence sitters even give offense that Rain F has splashed all over you, has splashed all over you? It would seem not, it would seem not. You don't even give it a thought, you don't even give it a thought. Fish from Scott from Canada, fish, Scott from Canada, fish, celebration for fish. Fish in the verses, the Uber kitten, are you goat or are you fish? Luke Duke is goat, celebration for goat. That's another goat, Luke, that's another goat. Fish, 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 goat, goat, goat. We just need the Uber kitten in this verses. And Hobbit 9000, Uber kitten, goat, celebration for goat. A mighty Uber kitten goat. And Hobbit 9000, going back in the verses. Ooh, Cryptid 51 is celebration the fish. Cryptid 51, are you goat or are you fish? Cryptid 51, here with the musications, are you goat or are you fish? And Hobbit 9000, are you goat or fish? Fish. Hobbit 9000 declared fish. Celebration for the Hobbit fish. Celebration for the Hobbit fish. Celebration for the Hobbit fish. Large hairy fins on that Hobbit fish. Large hairy fins. Celebration, the Uber kitten goat. Celebration for goat. Celebration for goat. And let's have a look at that poll. Let's have a look at that poll, goat and fish. Let's have a look at that poll, goat and fish. Let's have a look at the poll and let's see how the verses versus this verses. And the verses versus. With Julie Mr. Humdinger with 680 for the fence. Oh, I don't know about that verses. Julie Mr. Humdinger with 680 for the fence. Indefensible. Goat, Amy Canna, 156 with 510 votes for goat. Joy Kills with 10 for goat, Wow Mom with 380 for goat. Celebration, Ayo, Space Coyote, are you goat or fish? Space Coyote, welcome back to Goat versus Fish. And Goat versus Fish for unification, work in 1984, really working it for that unification. And Joy Kills with 60 for unification. But Fish wasn't having it this verses. Julie Mr. Humdinger, 3,634 fish. Joy Kills is all over the verses. And ATGs, are you watching Goat versus Fish on America's Got Talent, ATGs? With 10 points for fish. Joy Kills with 30, and Julie Mr. Humdinger with a massive verses for fish. Celebration, Julie and Mr. Humdinger with the mighty verses. On Goat versus Fish Thursday, Goat versus Fish, a shout out Shout out for Julian Mr. Humdinger. Weston 310, welcome to Goat vs. Fish. Weston 310, welcome to Goat vs. Fish. Celebration for, wow, we're still getting double verses. Celebration for forever following Goat vs. Fish. For forever following Goat vs. Fish. For forever following Goat vs. Fish. The alerts on Goat vs. Fish. The verses are double the verses. We're getting double the verses on Goat vs. Fish. Where's the alerts for Goat vs. Fish? Where's the alerts for Goat vs. Fish? Where are we getting double verses? So there's one versus. There's Goat vs. Fish. Goat vs. Fish. C, go, aqua goat, aqua goat. Scuba goat, scuba goat. Celebration for aqua goat, celebration for aqua goat. Celebration for aqua goat. Celebration for aqua goat, Goat vs. Fish. Celebration for aqua goat, strange verses. Goat vs. Fish, we have that verses, we have that verses. We have that verses. Why are we getting double alerts on Goat vs. Fish? Should there not be? Where's the other alerts on Goat vs. Fish? So that's one versus. That's one versus. That's another versus. That's a versus. Goat vs. Fish. We cannot even perceive the other alerts on Goat vs. Fish. What a strange versus. Unless it is hiding somewhere on Goat vs. Fish? Hiding somewhere unseen on Goat vs. Fish? Hiding somewhere unseen on Goat vs. Fish? Ah, Goat vs. Fish! Goat vs. Fish knows Goat vs. Goat vs. Fish, we know the verses now. Now we know the verses. We are learning about Goat vs. Fish, so we need to eliminate those verses. Remove that verses. Remove that verses. Okay, Goat and Fish. Now we have the verses. Now we have the verses. Celebration. Now we have the verses on Goat vs. Fish. Now we have single verses. We're back to one verses per verses, Goat and Fish. Weston 310 says, go aqua goat, go aqua goat. Hobby Rambo does not think they know the verses. The verses is, are you goat or are you fish? Are you goat or are you fish? That's the verses. That's the verses of Goat versus Fish. That's the verses of Goat versus Fish. I think my hardware prevented the speed voting. How much time do you have between the votes? You can just, as fast as you can verse. Hobby Rambo's Goat, celebration for Goat. But we've got Weston 310, the aqua goat. So let's go look at the aqua goat. Let's go look at the aqua goat. That's two more goat in the verses. Let's go look at that aqua goat. Let's go see how aqua goat is doing. Let's go see how aqua goat is doing in Goat versus Fish. Let's go see how aqua goat is doing in Goat versus Fish. So all of these verses, these will be faster once we have done the programification. Let's go have a look at aqua goat. Let's go have a look at aqua goat. Make some noise for aqua goat. Make some noise for aqua goat. Celebration for goat. Celebration for aqua goat. Celebration for aqua goat. Aqua goat. Aqua goat. Aqua goat. Weston says, I'm an Aquarius, so fish. Now wait a verses. Weston 310, we know it's your first verses. So are you goat or are you fish? Are you goat or are you fish? Are you goat or fish? Are you goat or fish? And know this. You do not have to be fish just because the stars told you that you are. You do not have to be fish because the stars told you you are fish. You can choose goat or fish for yourself. If you want to be goat or fish, it is up to you and you alone. Are you goat or are you fish? Weston 310, fish goat. Fence sitter, fence sitter, fence sitter. Yes, Weston, yes. Never, never tell goat versus fish if you're a goat or a fish. And be a fence sitter just like me. Be a fence sitter just like me. Leave goat versus fish cross-eyed and frustrated. Ah! Weston 310.
The electric fence.
Fence sitter. So much for goat. Sorry, goat. That's one less goat in the verses. We know, goat. We know, goat. We know, goat. We know. Fence sitter. Poor goats. For lack of a goat, for want of a goat, that could be the whole verses. That could be the whole verses. That could be the whole verses. Poor goats. Hobby Ramo is a goat. Celebration for goat. Who gives a fence about pie skis? Hobby Ramo's goat. Celebration for 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 goat. Goat and fish, goat and fish. Let's do a marbleization race on goat versus fish, of which you are so fond, of which you are so fond. Space Coyote is feeling fishy. Space Coyote is feeling fishy. Celebration for fish. 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 Ooh, Chanvegivre. Welcome to Goat versus Fish. Are you goat or are you fish? Exclamation play to join Goat versus Fish. Exclamation play to join Goat versus Fish. Exclamation play to join Goat versus Fish. You have 333 seconds to join Goat versus Fish. Fish mate, celebration for fish. Celebration for fish mate. Fish mate, fish great. Fish mate, fish great. We have 9 fish and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 goat. 9 fish and 11 goat. Unifications. I don't want to join Goat versus Fish. You do not have to join the marbleization race, Hobby Ramo. It will just make it harder for the goat to triumph. Work in 1984 wants to play with Goat versus Fish. So here we have a unification. And in the current verses, we have goat is winning the verses. Goat is currently winning the verses of how many goat and fish. In the verses of subscription, though one of the subscription goes to the side of goat, one unification goes to the side of goat because the unification favors balance between goat and fish. So the unification goes to the goat side, but the fish still triumph with 2 for fish. And only 1 for goat, and only 1 for goat. So that versus goes to fish, that versus goes to fish. We have not yet had any raids or marbleizations, but the polls go to fish. So in the current verses, come on fish, come and snook. So in the current verses of Goat versus Fish, we have 2 for fish, 1 for goat, and 1 for unification. So we are currently in unification. We remain in unification. These unifications are very strong on Goat versus Fish. Even one unification, even one versus is unification, it can really make the verses. It can really make the verses, but that's just how it's going on Goat versus Fish. If the goat or fish want to triumph, we're going to have to verse a little bit harder at it, Goat and Fish, but many of you are favoring unification, and so it's happening on Goat versus Fish. What is unification? Rain Felicia, are you goat or are you fish? What is unification? In the beginning, there was Goat versus Fish, the goat fish, and Goat versus Fish said that there should be goat and that there should be fish. And there was a great harmonization between goat and fish. The goat and fish, the goat and fish. The goat and fish enjoyed a special verses of Goat versus Fish, the goat fish. But then, The pitiable fence-sitter spoke fancy deceptions to the goat and fish and said you could be other things like snakes or rhinoceros or dino bones or whatever the fence. And then fenciness divided goat from fish. But once you and Goat versus Fish ask everyone and everything in the universe, are you goat or fish? And everyone and everything has declared goat or fish. Then we will have an epic versus. We will have an epic versus of goat and fish. And once it is determined who does triumph, the goat or the fish, we will determine who does triumph, the goat or the fish. And the goat and fish will versus, and the goat and fish will versus forever and ever. And it is said, and it is said, and it is written that one versus. At one versus, the goat and fish will have verses for so long that they will enter unification again, that they will enter unification by way of verses once all the fences have been defensed. Exclamation play for Goat versus Fish. It's really a simple verses. It's really a simple verses of Goat versus Fish. Hobbit 9000, Work in 1984, The Uber Kitten, Hobby Ramo 99, Goat versus Fish, Scott from Canada, Rain Felicia. And in the mean verses, we can have some fun with Goat versus Fish. We can have some fun with Goat versus Fish. Are you goat or are you fish? Are you goat or fish? Are you goat or are you fish? Hobbit 9000 now versing. Hobbit 9000 now versing. I will scream at the neighbors, unification. Scream unification, ah, unification! We think that would be a brilliant versus. The Uber Kitten. Yes, this will be a mighty versus once we can do this on Goat versus Fish. We'll spend less verses fencing around in there, more verses speaking to you, goat and fish. It's all about the little verses. Hobby Ramo, Hobbit 9000. Wait, last? How did that happen? Well, you're just leading from behind, Scott from Canada. Leading from behind. Whereas Hobbit 9000 is leading from the front. Welcome, Hobbit 9000, to Goat versus Fish. Hobbit 9000, but there's lots of fences in this track. Lots of fences. Hobbit 9000 taking a middle versus. Hobby Ramo hates when they get stuck in the fence. Yes, don't we all? Don't we all hate when we get stuck on the fence? Hobbit 9000, the Uber Kitten, now jockeying for verses. Hobbit 9000 perhaps clearing the way for other Goat and Fish. Uber Kitten better make a maneuver this versus. Hobbit 9000 could get yeeted at any versus. Stopped by the fence. Hobbit 9000 getting a bit fenced up there. But Hobbit 9000 continues. Uber Kitten is making up a few verses, but it's not enough. Hobbit 9000 takes the verses. Celebration! Hobbit 9000 takes the verses, and here comes Work in 1984 and Hobby Ramo. Let's watch Scott from Canada that continue their verses. We have Hobbit 9000 with the verses for fish. That's a marbleization win for fish. Hobbit 9000. Do you wish your marble win to go to fish, or do you wish unification between goat and fish? Or do you want to give it to goat? We suppose you could be a traitorous fish and give the marble win for goat. What do you say to Goat versus Fish? What do you say to Goat versus Fish? What do you say to Goat versus Fish? Hobbit 9000, this is your verses. This is your verses. All verses on you, Hobbit 9000. All verses on you. All verses on you. All verses on you. Marbleization win. Goat, fish, unification. What's the verses? What do I win, says Hobby Ramo?
Nothing.
Hobbit 9000 is not here to claim the verses. Hobbit 9000 is not here to claim the verses. Hobbit 9000 is not here to claim the verses. So the verses... Well, if Hobbit 9000 is not here to claim the verses, does that really mean that we abandon verse? We think so. Hobbit 9000 is not here to claim the verses. Spin the verses? Spin the verses. We think that we could give it to the Uber Kitten, but Goat versus Fish. But Goat versus Fish. We would rather verses again. We'd rather verses again, but this verses counts for double the verses. Goat and Fish, this verses counts for double the verses. Exclamation play to join Goat versus Fish. Exclamation play to join Goat versus Fish. You have double 69 seconds to join the verses. You have double 69 seconds to join the verses. Exclamation play to join Goat versus Fish. Double 69 seconds to join the verses. Double 69 seconds to join the verses. And this will count for 2 verses. This will count for 2 verses, for the previous verses was forfeit by a fish who won the verses but was not there. Won the verses but was not there. This shall count for double the verses. This shall count for double the verses. This shall count for double the verses. Ah, and now Goat versus Fish. We can use the power of the verses. We can use the power of the verses while we are doing this verses. Yes, Goat versus Fish. Yes, Goat versus Fish. So we can do that verses. Yes, we do that verses. And Goat versus Fish. Yes, this is a verse improvement for Goat versus Fish. Exclamation play to join Goat versus Fish. While you're joining Goat versus Fish is setting up a verses now that you can't even perceive on Goat versus Fish. That you can't even perceive on Goat versus Fish. That you can't even perceive on Goat versus Fish. But we're still making the verses. Are you goat or are you fish? Are you goat or are you fish? Goat and fish. Goat versus fish. Goat versus fish. Scott from Canada is playing on Goat versus Fish. Scott from Canada is playing on Goat versus Fish. Scott from Canada is playing on Goat versus Fish. Julian Mr. Humdinger is playing on Goat versus Fish. Playing on Goat versus Fish. Playing on Goat versus Fish. And the verses begin, Goat and Fish. The verses begin, Goat and Fish. The verses begin. And the verses begin, Goat and Fish. And we are off to the verses. We are off to the verses. We are off to the verses, Goat and Fish. We are off to the verses. Oh, Goat versus Fish. Oh, Goat versus Fish. We're off to the verses. Celebration for Goat versus Fish. Celebration for Goat versus Fish. Still learning how to do this verses. But yes, we are ready for the verses. We are ready for the verses. Julie, Mr. Humdinger now leading with celebration. Followed by Robbie Hamo. Followed by Hobby Ramo. And here comes. And where are the Electrolab is in the verses. Electrolab has made it to Goat versus Fish. Electrolab, are you goat or are you fish? Sham bam. OMG hi, sham bam. Thank you, ma'am. Welcome to Goat versus Fish. Electrolab has chosen goat. Sham bam bamina. Are you goat or are you fish? Sham bam. Are you goat or are you fish? Celebration for Electrolab Goat. Sham Bam is goat. Celebration for goat. The goat continue versing. The goat continue versing. Celebration for goat. A fine versus. A fine versus for goat. A fine versus for goat. A fine versus for goat. The Uber Kitten now leading on goat versus fish. The Uber Kitten now leading on goat versus fish. The Uber Kitten now leading on goat versus fish. The Uber Kitten now leading on goat versus fish. The Uber Kitten now leading on goat versus fish. Celebration for goat. Celebration for goat. Celebration for goat. And we have the Uber Kitten triumph. The Uber Kitten triumph. The Uber Kitten, are you goat or are you fish? Is this a win for goat? Is this a win for unification? Unhinged Granny says you are goat. Unhinged Granny says you are goat. The Uber Kitten, are you goat or are you fish? Goat, the Uber Kitten takes the marble wins for goat, and that's 2 marble wins for goat. That's 2 marble wins for goat. Goat with a decisive versus, with a decisive versus. Goat with a decisive versus. Celebration for goat, celebration for goat. And now with 2 fish in the verses and 2 goat in the verses. With 2 fish in the verses and 2 goat in the verses. And 1 unification. That means we remain in unification this versus. Goat versus fish. These unifications are very powerful. We're going to have to ponder this versus. We're going to have to ponder the unification because that means goat and fish. The fish could be leading. The fish could be leading by a whole fish, and the unification would make it goat. But then if the goat gets a versus, then it's still unification. And if a goat gets a 3rd versus, it's still unification. So if there's 2 fish and 1 unification, and goat wants to take the versus from fish, then goat would have to get 3 goat. Goat would have to get 2 more goat, 3 more goat. Goat would have to get 3 more goat. 3 more goat, although we could still call it a goat-favored unification. A unification with favor of goat. And so goat and fish could still versus for favor within the unification of goat and fish. So it's not a true domination of a triumph of goat, but it is a goat-dominant unification. So the goat could still feel pride that they have a goat-dominant unification as opposed to a fish-dominant unification. That would be a fair versus. That would add some nuance to the unification of goat versus fish. So maybe we'll try that versus. Maybe we'll try that versus. The Uber Kitten celebration. Work in 1984 says, I woke up and chose unification. Celebration. Celebration. Celebration for unification indeed. Goat and fish. Goat and fish. Guess what, goat and fish? It's time for Wheel of Verses. Goat and fish. Smash says fish, fish, fish. Celebration for fish, celebration for fish. Fish, fish. Celebration for fish. Celebration for fish. Celebration for fish. Celebration for fish. Let's get those spinning emotes in the chat of Goat versus Fish. Yes, work in 1984. Electrolab, yes. Hexy the Virus says fish. Celebration for fish. Celebration for fish. Hexy the Virus, fish. Goat and fish, we have 4 verses on the Wheel of Verses this verses. We have Twisty Goat Milk Run. We have Teach a Man to Fish Wisdom. We have Goat Horizontal Eye. And we have Crafty Bucket Fish, Goat and Fish. What's going to happen on Goat versus Fish? Will we land on Goat? Will we land on Fish and Goat and Fish? There's no fences in the verses this verses. There's no fences this verses on the spinning wheel of goat versus fish. Is that not a celebration? Is that not a celebration, goat and fish? That we have no fences this verses of goat versus fish. Let's spin the verses. Let's spin the verses. Let's spin the verses. Crafty bucket fish! Crafty bucket fish! Make some noise for crafty bucket fish, for crafty bucket fish! Crafty bucket fish! Crafty bucket fish wins the verses. 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 What could that mean on goat versus fish? 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 It means we're going to see something crafty on goat versus fish. We're going to see something crafty on goat versus fish. We're going to see something crafty on goat versus fish. And it's going to be a brilliant versus. It's going to be a brilliant versus. We think it's going to be a brilliant versus. Goat and fish. Make some noise. Make some joys for crafty bucket fish. Make some joys. Oh, goodness. Make some joys for crafty bucket. Crafty bucket. Fish! Behold the crafty bucket fish. Behold the glorious crafty bucket fish. It's a bucket of fish, bucket of fish. It's a whole bucket of fish. And just look at the fish and just look at the fish. Just look at those fish. Is that not a beautiful verses? Is that not a beautiful verses of fish? We think so. We think so, goat and fish. We saw this crafty bucket of fish and we just thought we have to have that on goat versus fish. We have to have it on goat versus fish. And look at the pride. Swelling with pride, that crafty bucket fish. Not just one fish, many fish. A whole bucket of fish, a whole bucket of fish, bucket of fish, bucket of fish, bucket of fish. Once, Ralph Mouth of Glowstick told goat versus fish about the bucket of fish, but scarcely have we seen such a glorious bucket of fish, such a glorious bucket of fish, right here on goat versus fish, right here on goat versus fish. Fish bucket. It says here, in case you didn't know that these were fish, we have the information. Fish bucket. Fish bucket. Look how big the fish. An illustration of fish on the line, a fish on the line. But goat and fish, the lines, the strings have been used not just to catch the fish, the strings have been used to make the fish. Let's count the fish eyes. 1 fish eye, 2 fish eye, 3 fish eye, 4 fish eye, 5 fish eyes, and perhaps 2 more fish eyes. Perhaps 4 more fish eyes. 4-eyed fish. H.H. Hook says, the fishy bucket is full again. If you've been waiting for a fishy, there's going to be a big old fish drop this Saturday versus December 2nd at 12 p.m. AST, and that was 46 weeks ago. But that was last verses. Goat and fish, fish bucket. Wow, Mom, our resident expert. creationer of giant goat and fish, how long do you suppose it would take to make a bucket of fish like this? To make a bucket of fish like this. Make a bucket of fish like this. Celebration, goat versus fish. The link is in the chat, goat and fish. The link is in the chat. About 3 days, says Smash. It would take many a verses. Super Kitten says it would take many a verses. Goat and fish. This has been Wheel of Verses on Goat versus Fish. What do you think? Do you think that this goat could take on a whole bucket of fish? Goat and fish, who would triumph? An informal versus in the chat of Goat versus Fish. Who would triumph? Wow Mom's goat? Wow Mom's goat or the entire bucket of fish? Who would triumph in the verses? Wow Mom's goat or the entire bucket of fish? We want your opinion on goat versus fish. We want to know. We want to know, goat and fish. Who does triumph? Wow Mom's goat or bucket of fish? Leave your notation in the chat. Leave your notation in the chat and tell us your evidence. This goat is bigger than any one of the individual fish. However, those fish are an entire bucket of fish. The Uber Kitten says bucket fish are only 2D. Goat can jump around them. Goat can jump around them, but then that means fish can go flat, and the goat might not even see the two-dimensional fish. Goat could be looking out in the verses, and suddenly a fish just appears out of verses. Unseen fish, suddenly a whole fish. Can goat even stomp flat a two-dimensional fish? It's already a flat fish. Depends on if the competition is held in water or in a field. Well, we think it's happening right here. The fish are in a bucket. So we think that the fish have all the waters that they need. The fish must have all the waters that they need because the fish are already in a bucket. And so long as the fish are in a bucket, then they would appear to have all the hydration. They can take the hydration with them whencever they go. Whencever they go, they can take the hydration. Goat and fish, this has been Bucket of Fish. This has been Bucket of Fish on Wheel of Verses. Celebration for the Wheel of Verses. Celebration with a Wheel of Verses. Goat and fish. 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 Okay, goat and fish. You know what it's timing for. You know what it's timing for. It is timing for a meditation of goat versus fish. It is timing for a meditation of goat versus fish. Havoc Woods says, Goat versus Fish, I bought my ticket for tonight. I've never been to any shows before and I'm excited for tonight. Is God goat or fish? Havoc Woods, you have never been to any show ever? This is your first show ever in the universe? Celebration. It will be a mighty versus. It will be a mighty versus, Havoc Woods. You will have to tell us whom you are because Goat versus Fish won't know whom you are without you telling Goat versus Fish because you recognize Goat versus Fish, but Goat versus Fish has never perceived you. And Havoc Woods has deleted their own verses. For some verses. Okay. Okay, as you wish. As you wish. I will surely say hello to Goat versus Fish. Celebration. Goat and Fish, Goat versus Fish does have a show in Los Angeles this versus, so do join Goat versus Fish. If you're in Los Angeles, there's still timing. It's at 7:30 at the Lyric Hyperion. It's called A Serious Show. And you know it's serious because they have Goat versus Fish. We know it's serious. They have Goat versus Fish. They have Goat versus Fish. Ah, so Goat versus Fish, we know what we know what versus now. Now Goat versus Fish knows what versus. Your Twitch login isn't versus. Well, you should You should find out that verses. Celebration, Bunkbot with the verses. Bunkbot with 1 month for Goat vs. Fish. Great show for a first show. I wish I were going Bunkbot, the goat, with GoatScription, with GoatScription. 2 GoatScription for goat, 2 GoatScription for goat, celebration for goat, celebration for goat. 2 GoatScription for goat, 2 GoatScription points for Bunkbot with a resubscription to Goat vs. Fish celebration. May Goat vs. Fish remind the goat and fish, remind the goat and fish that Goat vs. Fish currently has 95 subscribers, Goat and Fish, 95 subscribers. Can we get 5 more subscriptions on Goat vs. Fish so Goat vs. Fish can once again have 100 subscriptions on Goat vs. Fish, can once again have 100 subscriptions on Goat vs. Fish? Would that not be a beautiful versus? So Goat and Fish. So now let's get this verses. Let's get this verses. Let's get this verses. Let's get this verses. Goat and Fish. Will you be streaming the show? We don't think so. We don't think so. If it were just Goat vs. Fish, we would stream the show. But Goat vs. Fish is hosting the verses, and there are many others partaking of the show that may not consent to being on the living stream. So Goat vs. Fish, we cannot simply show up and start living streaming the whole show on the verses. That would not be very verses of Goat vs. Fish. That would not be very verses. That would not be very verses of Goat vs. Fish. Goat vs. Fish, we think we need to creation some elevation back here. Some elevation back here so we can elevation the fish and the goat so they can sort of be hovering in the universe. I think that would be a fun verses. We think that would be a fun verses. So Goat and Fish, it is time for a meditation of Goat vs. Fish. It is time for a meditation of Goat vs. Fish. It's time for a meditation of Goat vs. Fish. Maybe we can combine these verses. Let's just combine the verses, just for the fun of Goat vs. Fish. Just for the fun of Goat vs. Fish. So we can add this verses, we can do this verses, and Goat vs. Fish. We can do that verses. We can do that verses. Let's have fun with this verses. Let's have fun with this verses. So Goat vs. Fish will go to this place, and then we'll do Goat vs. Fish, move value on Goat vs. Fish, and another move value on Goat vs. Fish. Watch this verses. Watch this verses. Another move value on Goat vs. Fish. Another move value on Goat vs. Fish, and then this verses will make this 2,000 verses long, and we'll make this 2,000 verses long. Make it 3,000 verses long. 3,000 verses long. And then this verse is color correction for Goat vs. Fish, setting, opacity, Goat vs. Fish, opacity. This is what we have learned. This is what we have learned, Goat and Fish. And this verse is, we shall have one verses, one whole verses. We shall have one whole verses. This verse is, we shall have no verses. We shall have no verses in that verses. Then this verses will go to that verses, and that verses will go to this verses. Goat vs. Fish. Goat vs. Fish. Next verses, we go to the fish, and then this verses. Next verses, we go to the goat. Then Celebration. Celebration, goat and fish. You see, goat and fish, you see how it verses? You see how it verses now? You see how it verses now, goat and fish? Now we can move between goat and fish. 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 And is that not a celebration? Rain Felicia, are you goat or are you fish? Yes, goat versus fish. Yes, that's the power of goat versus fish. Yes, that's the power of goat versus fish. Yes, that's the power of goat versus fish. False verses. Oats versus quiche. Probably oats. Oats are probably goats and quiche are probably the fish. It sounds like oats is goats and quiche is fish. It sounds like oats is goats and quiche is fish. It is time for a meditation. It is time for a meditation of goat versus fish. It is timing for a meditation of goat versus fish. It is timing for a meditation of goat versus fish, waste of space, goat. It is timing for a meditation on goat versus fish. Prepare yourselves for a relaxation of meditation of goat versus fish. Choose your verses. Choose your verses in the chat. You may meditation upon whatever you wish. You may meditation upon goat versus fish. You may meditation upon are you goat or fish. You may meditation upon goat or fish or unifications. Post your meditations in the chat of goat versus fish. And of course, you may make donations to goat versus fish during the meditation of goat versus fish. Please come into our humble verses. As you enter the verses, there's a place for the reception of donation to goat versus fish. Donation is a meditation of goat versus fish. Donation is a meditation of goat versus fish. And let us now enjoy together a relaxation of meditation of goat versus fish, a classic verses from the earlier verses of the streams of goat versus fish, as we chant together in celebration of goat versus fish, of goat versus fish. Goat versus fish, 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 goat fish, goat fish, goat fish, goat fish, goat versus 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 fish. versus fish, goat 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 versus fish, goat, fish, goat, fish, goat, fish, goat, fish. Goat versus fish, goat versus fish, goat versus fish, goat versus fish, goat, 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 fish, fish, fish. 最初からヤギ vs 魚でございました。ヤギと魚はいつでもどこでもどこにもずっと vs している。でもフェンス触りはフェンスの上に座っていました。フェンス座りは、俺はヤギか魚ではないと言いました。だから、これからヤギと魚は別々に山は山を登って魚は海で泳ぐ。ある日ヤギと魚は一緒になります。一緒に戦わないことになる。今はヤギ対魚です。バーセズは強い。選びなさい。君はヤギか魚ですか？Goat versus fish. This has been a meditation of goat versus fish. This has been a meditation of goat versus fish. 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 Are we enjoying our meditation? Are we enjoying our meditation, goat and fish? Flunk waffle, are you goat or are you fish? Much more relaxation. Flunk waffle, are you goat or are you fish? Flunkwaffle, are you goat? Or are you fish? Goat must know, fish must know. Electrolab celebration. Celebration. Flunkwaffle is goat. Make some noise for the goat. Make some noise for the goat. Make some noise for the goat. Abby Ramos says, I don't like meditation verses. Well, guess what? It's still going to happen on Goat versus Fish. JJ Bond's goat. Celebration for goat. Celebration for goat. Matthew Big D. Are you goat or are you fish? Saying verses like that. Saying verses like that. That sounds like something that a fish might say. Unless you're a goat and you're making a mockery of fish. Matthew Big D goes goat. Celebration for goat. Celebration for goat. Celebration for goat. Flunkwaffle goat. Matthew Big D goat. Celebration for goat. Celebration for goat. 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 Goats. 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 Hey man, I love seeing you at TwitchCon. Poseidon 106. Make some noise for Poseidon 106. Poseidon 106. Hey, I loved seeing you at TwitchCon. Well, Goat versus Fish remains on. Goat versus Fish remains on. Poseidon 106. Are you goat or are you fish? Are you goat or are you fish? Poseidon 106. Poseidon 106. Poseidon 106. Poseidon goes fish. Celebration for fish. Celebration for fish. Celebration for fish. Celebration for fish. Poseidon fish. Poseidon fish. Poseidon fish. Autumn Samurai, a celebration for fish. More fish in the verses. More fish in the verses. Celebration for fish. Whoa, it's been a long time since I've been to a verses. Goat versus Fish has been streaming. I come in the name of fish. Kel Circle goes fish. Goat versus Fish has actually been streaming a lot in the last 7 million millennium of Goat versus Fish. And we have been much more consistent in the living stream of Goat versus Fish. And look at this verses. Look at Goat versus Fish. Look at Goat versus Fish. Look at the power of Goat versus Fish. Ooh. Wow, Goat versus Fish. Ooh, Goat versus Fish. You have amazing new verses now. Ooh, so pretty is Goat versus Fish. So pretty is Goat versus Fish. More verses to entertain you as you grow tired of looking at Goat versus Fish. Oh, Goat versus Fish. Now you can look at the amazing verses. Amazing verses of Goat versus Fish. Celebration for intensification. Intensification on Goat versus Fish. Intensification on Goat versus Fish. Kel Circle the Fish back on Goat versus Fish. Welcome back to Goat versus Fish. So nice to have verses like Kel Circle back on Goat versus Fish. It's an incredible effectification. And that's just the beginning of Goat versus Fish. That's just the beginning of Goat versus Fish. That's just the beginning of Goat versus Fish. So many effectifications ready to happen on Goat versus Fish. Ready to happen still on Goat versus Fish. So many verses, so many verses. So many verses. And if it has been a long verses, Kel Circle, then maybe you need to hear this.
Do you be goat? Do you be goat? Do you be goat? Do you be fish?
Simon Cowell once said, goat cannot versus the fish. And it was a false versus.
Because the goats do be goat and the fish do be fish. Do you be
Goat or a fish?
Goat
versus fish.
Well, goat are of the land and fish are of the sea. Well, goat versus fish, which one do you be? Do you be goat or a fish?
It's a new versus, it's an old versus.
Because the goats do be goat and the fish do be fish. Do you be goat or
Do
a
you
fish?
be goat or do you be fish? Goat versus Fish. Kel Circle, where do you like to listen to your musications? On the Spotify, on YouTube, on Bandcamp, on Apple Musications. How do you like to listen to your musications?
Now repeat.
How do you like to listen to your
After goat
musications?
versus fish. Doobie 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 doobie.
YouTube Musication and let GoatVsFish send a link unto you.
Doobie goat, doobie goat, doobie goat, or doobie fish, a doobie goat or a fish, because the goat doobie goat and the fish doobie fish. Do you be goat or a fish? Don't sit on the fence. Well, goat versus fish.
The YouTube link is in the chat, GoatVsFish. The YouTube link is in the chat. Celebration.
Do you be goat or a fish? Do you be
Goat or a fish? Do you be goat or a fish? Do you be goat or a fish?
Because the goat doobie goat and the fish.
Incredible
doobie
verses.
fish. Do you be goat or a fish? Don't sit on the fence. Because the goat doobie goat and the fish doobie fish, the medieval fancier sits on the fence. But the goat doobie goat and the fish doobie fish. Do you be goat or a fish?
Celebration. Okay, Goat and Fish. We're going to sing a final verses. We're going to sing a final verses. We're going to sing a final verses with Goat versus Fish. We're going to sing a final verses with Goat versus Fish. We're going to sing a final verses with Goat versus Fish. We're going to sing a final verses. We're going to sing a final verses with Goat versus Fish. And that's going to be the verses because we must preparation for the show of Goat versus Fish. So get your Goat versus Fish ready, Goat and Fish. Get some Goat versus Fish ready in the chat of Goat versus Fish. It is timing. It's timing to sing the ode of Goat versus Fish. Fatality, welcome back to Goat versus Fish. Are you goat or are you fish? Get your Goat versus Fish emotes ready in the chat. It's time to sing along with Goat versus Fish. 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 Come on, Goat and Fish. Come on, Goat and Fish. Goat versus fish. Goat versus fish. versus fish. Goat 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 versus fish is wherever you are, whether you're near or you're far. Goat versus fish. Goat versus fish is wherever you are. Where have you come from? Where shall you go? Oh, what have you seen? To whom will you show? How can we learn and how can we grow? Does anyone even know? No, no, no. Does anyone even know that it's fish versus goat? Goat versus fish, goat versus fish. Dragon Balls 3, 2, 5, fish, 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 fish. Fish, fish, fish. Goat versus fish, goat versus fish. Goat versus fish, goat versus fish. Goat versus fish, goat versus fish, goat versus fish. Goat versus fish, goat versus fish. Celebration! Celebration for goat versus fish!
Contribution $5 to GoatVsFish. Celebration. Celebration for goat.
$5 versus American dollars for goat. $5 versus American dollars for goat. Celebration for goat. Celebration for goat. That's $5 versus American in contribution for goat. $5 versus American in contribution for goat. Goat versus fish. A new versus celebration for goat. Celebration for goat. Celebration for goat. And Dragon Balls with the fish. And Dragon Balls with the fish. Dragon Balls 325 with the fish. Celebration for fish. Celebration for fish. Celebration for fish. Celebration for fish. $5 versus American dollars contribution to goat versus fish. Appreciation, appreciation. It did not say who made the contribution to goat versus fish, so maybe it's just a mysterious versus. But goat and fish, that brings us closer. That brings us $5 versus American dollars closer to the 3x4 chalkboard on wheels of goat versus fish. To the 3x4 chalkboard on wheels of goat versus fish. Appreciation. Appreciation, goat and fish. Appreciation, goat and fish. Appreciation, goat and fish. Appreciation, goat and fish. That's a big verses. That's a big verses. 5 versus American dollars is a huge versus. We appreciation such a huge versus of goat versus fish. Let's give you a new verses. Let's give you another verses. Jedi Grind! It was Jedi Grind, the whole verses. Well, there's a place we can go while we fish and we goat. It's the place that everybody know as Celebration Island. As Celebration Island. Well, there's a place we can go while we fish and we goat. It's the place that everybody know as Celebration Island. A Celebration Island. Hoof in hoof and a fin in fin. Where do the verses end and where do they begin? In a celebration who would win? In goat versus fish. There are mountains so tall goats can climb them all, and there isn't even heavy urban sprawl on Celebration Island. On Celebration Island. There are mountains so tall goats can climb them all, and there isn't even any urban sprawl on Celebration Island. On Celebration Island. Have a look at that mighty horn. They're climbing mountain tops in the early morn. Looks like that wool needs to be shorn. No celebration for the goat. Oh, there are waters so deep, fish can go there to sleep, and the fence sitter won't even make a peep on Celebration Island. Oh, there are waters so deep, fish can go there to sleep, and the fence sitter won't even make a peep on Celebration Island. On Celebration Island. Make some noise for that fin. Bursting through the ocean top in a glistening. Celebration for the fish. Sweet, we can go there to eat and admire the award-winning feat on Celebration Island. On Celebration Island. Oh, there are verses so sweet, we can go there to eat, and the fence sitter won't even make a peep on Celebration Island. totem fish impaired. You can curse on it and you can swear, but nobody cares. The sand is glass and the air is bleach when you're sitting on a fence on Dead End Beach. On Dead End Beach. On Dead End Beach. The clouds are ash and the sea is tar. They're charging $15 for a PBR. On Dead End Beach. On Dead End Beach. GoatVsFish is just out of your reach when you're sitting on a fence on Dead End Beach. On Dead End Beach. On Dead End Beach. Random TV, Neek is glad that there's three of you. The very unique GoatVsFish. The very unique GoatVsFish. Look at all three GoatVsFish. Look at all three GoatVsFish. Appreciation. Appreciation. Appreciation for the musician of Goat versus Fish. And now it is time to count the verses. Time to count the verses, Goat and Fish. Time to count the verses. Time to count the verses. And we have a suspicion about this verses. Anyone else get buffering? Have a look at this. You want to see buffering? There's your buffering on Goat versus Fish. There's your buffering on Goat versus Fish. There's your buffering on Goat versus Fish. Goatfish. Neek, are you goat or are you fish? Neek, are you goat or are you fish? Wow, Deb underscore. The buffering does not seem to stop you from making comments about the underarm stains of Goat versus Fish. Have a look at that versus. Have a look at this versus. Do you know what that is? That's called hard versus. That's called hard versus of Goat versus Fish, entertaining you, Goat and Fish. You think this is an easy versus? Why don't you get a real versus, Deb triple underscore? Why don't you get a real versus? And then maybe you would understand Goat versus Fish. Then maybe you would understand the trials and tribulations of Goat versus Fish that Goat versus Fish does for you. Generation Fence. And why don't you get an education while you're at it, Deb triple underscore? Since you don't know how to spell words. Do some hard verses and get some education. Generation Fence. Generation Fence. Generation Fence. We think we need to put that in the verses of Goat versus Fish. Generation Fence. That's coming back on Goat versus Fish. That's a turn of verses. That's a turn of verses that needs to return to Goat versus Fish. Generation Fence. Generation Fence! Back in my verses, we all chose Goat or Fish, and it was a celebration. But now Generation Fence just wants to sit on the fence all verses and just complain about Goat versus Fish. Why don't you get a real verses? Why don't you get a real verses? Generation Fence wants to versus up and be like, oh, I'll be a crab versus a shrimp. Back in my verses, we chose Goat or Fish because it was the one true verses, and it still is the one true verses. Deb has apologized to Goat versus Fish. Your apologization is accepted by Goat versus Fish. Unequivocationally accepted by Goat versus Fish. Unequivocationally accepted by Goat versus Fish. The Derp Jesus, it's always Goat, Bro, Fish, or lesser beings. That definitely sounds like something the Derp Jesus would say. We have already accepted your apologization, Deb. It has already been accepted by Goat versus Fish. Neek celebration. Neek, are you Goat or are you Fish? The Derp Jesus goes Goat. Deb underscore, are you Goat or are you Fish? Are you Goat or are you Fish? So Generation Fence. Jedi Grind the Goat with 5 versus American contribution to Goat versus Fish. A huge versus. A huge versus for Goat versus Fish. Jedi Grind with 5 versus American dollars for Goat versus Fish. 5 for Goat versus Fish. 3s, 4s, 5s. Wow. Wow, goat versus fish. Wow, goat versus fish. Wow, goat versus fish. Guess what, Hobby Rambo? There won't be a next marbleization on goat versus fish. Not on this versus. But maybe the next versus will be a mighty versus. Let's count the goat and fish. Fish. 1s, 2s, 3s, 4s, 5s, 6s, 7s, 8s, 9s, 10s, 11s, 12s, 13s, 14s, 15 for the fish. 15 for the fish. 16 for the fish with Neek going fish. 16 for the fish. And goat. 1s, 2s, 3s, 4s, 5s, 6s, 7s, 8s, 9s, 10s, 11s, 12s, 13s, 14s, 15s, 16s, 17 for goat. So goat, keep the verses. Celebration for goat. Goat, keep the verses. Goat, keep the verses. In the verses of subscription, there was a unification declared. There was a unification in the verses. Inscription, there was a unification for verses. So goat versus fish, let's look at this verses. We've got 3 fish and 1 unification. Perhaps for the unification to triumph in the verses, there needs to be unification in excess of the difference between the goat and fish. That would make unification slightly less powerful on goat versus fish. That would make unification slightly less powerful on goat versus fish. If one for the unification, because we know that if the fish want to versus, that if the fish want to versus the goat, and the goat want to versus the fish, then there is not unification. So perhaps in future verses, there needs to be 1 unification in excess, 1 unification in excess of equal verses for it to be a dominance of unification in that verses. So in this verses, we have 3 subscriptions for fish. Hobby Rambo says unification is a tasteless verses. So 3 for fish and goat with 2 and a unification. And a unification in the verses. So let's call this verses for fish. Let's call it, wait to verses, but it's only 2 fish. It's 2 fish, 2 goat. It's 2 fish, 2 goat and a unification. So that is a unification. That is a unification. 2 fish and 2 goat, that is a unification because there's 2 fish and 2 goat and there's a unification atop the verses. There's unification atop the verses. The fact that it all makes sense is really entertaining. Yes, the sense of goat versus fish. So we're going to call that a unification of fish. Marbleization has been domination by goat. There's no denying it. Goat win the verses and fish win the polls. So with the unification in its verses, we have fish, fish, goat, goat, goat. And there's been no radiations. There's been no radiations. No radiation, so radiation gets fenced. Radiation gets fenced because there's been no radiation on goat versus fish. Now, unification, domination, the bits, because we have 524 for goat and 225 for fish, and unification takes the verses for bits. However, fences destroy unifications. Fences destroy unifications. So that unification gets elimination. That unification gets elimination. So we have 1 versus for goat. We have 1 versus for goat. Goat and fish. 1 versus for goat, goat and, well that's a unification for goat and fish. So that unification is going to favor either the goat or the fish in the verses. So that's a unification. So we have 1 win for goat, 1 win for fish, another win for goat, but because the unification is a unification, it goes to the side of the fish. However, the unification being on the verses of the fish still leaves 2 goat and 1 fish and 1 unification. So there would need to have been 1 more unification in order for the unification to domination the verses, because now we have 2 goat and we have 1 fish. So if that fence had not fenced up the unification, then there would be 1 more unification. But then there might have also been another goat or a fish. Rain Felicia says So with that unification being fenced and this unification, but this unification is a unification. So we have one unification. We have one unification for goat and for fish and for goat. So do we give this versus to goat? Do we give this versus to goat? Do we give this versus to goat? Or is it a unification, or is it a goat-heavy unification? Electrolab goat. Robbie Hemmel radiation. Deb rated goat versus fish with 1. Nice verses. Nice attempted verses of goat versus fish. Nice an attempted versus. Subscription for goat versus fish. Deb subscription to goat versus fish. Deb subscription to goat versus fish. Deb, are you goat or are you fish? This could change the whole verses. Deb, are you goat or are you fish? Fish, Deb is fish. Deb is fish with a fish scription, resubscription to goat versus fish. So fish get the verses, so fish get the verses, which means that this verses is domination by fish, which means we have fish, and we have fish, and we have goat, and we have goat, but that's still 2 fish and 2 goat. Resubscription, Deb for the resubscription. So goat versus fish. The alerts are getting pretty fancy on goat versus fish, but that was the resubscription. Appreciation for Deb for the subscription for fish. For the subscription for fish. So that means there's 2 fish in the verses and 2 goat in the verses. So instead of a goat dominant unification, so instead of a goat dominant unification, it's an even unification because there's 2 for the fish and 2 for the goat. We think that's the verses. There was a raid just now, says Random TV Fish. Well, there was a raid of 1 viewer, but we didn't see an alert because guess what? There's no alert for 1 viewer raids. Not a unification? Well, listen, goat and fish. Well, listen, goat and fish. Listen, don't fence around with goat versus fish. Goat versus fish will know if you're fencing around with goat versus fish. Goat versus fish knows if you're fencing around with goat versus fish. Flip a versus, is Hobby Ramo? No! Hobby Ramo! You want goat to win this versus? You want goat to win this versus? 500 bits. For another 500 bits, goat will overcome the power of the advantage to unification. For another 500 bits, goat would overcome the verses of unification. For 500 bits, goat could take the verses. For 500 bits, goat could take the verses. Or a tip of $5 American dollars. Do you grow tired of unification? Well, you'd better verse harder, goat and fish. Those goat and fish who want unification are versing harder. They got in early. Deb with the gifted verses. Deb with the gifted verses. Deb with the gifted verses for fish. Deb with the gifted verses for fish. Rainbow Magic Gems follows goat versus fish. Celebration for Rainbow Magic Gems. Celebration for Rainbow Magic Gems who follows goat versus fish. Celebration. Rainbow Magic Gems, are you goat or are you fish? Random TV with 800 bits. 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 Random TV with 800 bits for fish. Random TV with 800 bits for fish. That's 1,025 for fish. Fish has overtaken the unification in the verses of bits with Random TV, so the unification goes to fish. It goes to fish. It goes to fish. It goes to fish. It goes to fish. And Deb with the gifted verses. Deb with the gifted verses for fish. Deb with the gifted verses for fish. Securing the triumph of fish. That means 3 votes for fish. 3 votes for fish and 2 for goat. Fish are domination the verses. 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 4 subs to 2 subscription for goat. Marble wins goes goat, but polls go fish. And bits with 1,025 go to fish, and goat with 500, and appreciation for the gifted verses Deb. Appreciation for the gifted verses Deb. And by the verses, Deb underscore. And by the verses, Deb underscore. By the verses, Deb underscore. Fatality, are you goat or are you fish? Fatality, welcome back to Goat vs. Fish. And by the verses, because you have subscribed to Goat vs. Fish. Deb, because you are subscribed to Goat vs. Fish. Because you have subscribed to Goat vs. Fish. All subscribers get a decal from Goat vs. Fish. You may fill out the form in the chat, and if you fill out the form, Deb, you can get a free decal that says Goat vs. Fish if you fill out the verses because you are subscribed to Goat vs. Fish. Celebration for Deb. Thunderhead says, hi, Goat. Thunderhead is going Goat. Wait, the verses. Thunderhead is going Goat. Thunderhead is going Goat. Securing Goat. Securing Goat. Securing Goat. Goat and Fish. Okay, Goat and Fish. This is an intense verses. Random TV with 800 bits. Random TV with 800 bits. Random TV with 800 bits. Goat versus Fish. 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 Goat and Fish, the 60-second countdown is about to begin on Goat vs. Fish. Goat and Fish, the 60-second countdown is about to begin on Goat vs. Fish. The 60-second countdown is about to begin on Goat vs. Fish. Goat would need 502 bits to overcome the fish, or 3 gifted subscriptions. Or 3 gifted subscriptions. Goat and Fish, this is a big versus. This is a big versus. This is a big versus. But there's not much timing left, Goat and Fish. There's not much timing left, Goat and Fish. There's not much timing left, Goat and Fish. There's not much timing left. Final verses. Deb with 200 bits. Deb with 200 bits. Stop the verses. 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 Goat and Fish. Goat versus Fish. Wait that verses. Deb. Deb with 200 bits. Deb with 200 bits for Fish. Deb securing the 200 bits for Fish. Securing the 200 bits for Fish. With securing now 200 more bits for Fish. Deb securing the verses, but the verses is not over. The verses is not ended. The verses ends in 1 minuet. Fish! Fish is dominating the goat! Fish is dominating the goat! Fish is dominating the goat with the power of Deb and Random TV! Fish is dominating the goat despite Hobby Ramos' protestations. It's not fair! No! The unification! No, I'll do anything for unification! Please, Fish! Please, Fish! I didn't mean what I said about unification! I didn't mean what I said! Goat and Fish! The Fish! Goat! Versus Fish! The Fish! Do triumph! The Fish do triumph! The Fish do triumph. The Fish do triumph over the goat. The Fish do triumph. The Fish do triumph over the goat. The goat put up a mighty fine verses, but the Fish do triumph over the goat. The unification has gotten to Fish. It's no more unification, it's Fish. Fish! Fish! Celebration for Fish! Celebration for Fish! 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 Celebration for fish! Celebration for fish! Celebration for fish! 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 The streak of unification is ended! The streak of unification has ended and it's gone fish! The streak of unification has ended and it's gone fish, goat and fish. It's gone to the fish! It's gone to the fish! It's gone to the fish! Fish, fish! Fish, fish, fish! How are you feeling, goat and fish? Does it get you right in the feels? It should. That is the power of goat versus fish. That is how you know it is a mighty versus. Fish! Take the verses. After a streak of 4 verses. After a streak of 4 verses. And goat and fish, goat versus fish. Goat versus fish awards fish of the verses. Fish of the verses goes to Deb. Fish of the verses goes to Deb. Fish of the verses goes to Deb. Robbie Hamo. Hobby Remo the goat. Tried to verses. Pleaded for there not to be unification again. Well, Hobby Remo, your verses were answered. For while we can celebrate on random TV with the 800 bits, with the 800 bits, with the 800 bits, the 800 bits of random TV, we're in services of Deb who came through with that additional subscription for fish, which broke the unification and gave fish the verses. It was on the fins of Deb, which random TV's 800 bits. Fish of the verses goes to Deb with honorable verses. Honorable verses to random TV fish. Fish of the verses goes to Deb with random TV with the honorable verses. Celebration for fish! Celebration for fish! Celebration for fish! Celebration for fish! Celebration verses of goat versus fish, and we have to get back to used to doing this verses as well. We're doing this verses as well. Notes. This verses. But that's the same verses. Goat versus fish, goat versus fish, goat versus. Generation fence. Back in my verses, we chose goat or fish. Back in my verses, we chose goat or fish. Why don't you get a real versus? Generation fence. They don't even speak goat versus fish. They're just like skibbity fence. Skibbity fence. The skibbity fence generation. Thunderhead 81 celebration. Because the dope to be goat and the fish to be fish. Do you be goat or a fish? Don't sit on the fence. Fatality as long as you are on the stream of goat versus fish.
Came up to me and said a goat or a fish. Which one do you be? Do you be goat or a fish?
Goat versus fish fatality. Goat versus fish is posting the link in the chat. Fatality. The link is in your chat. The link is in your chat, so you can click on it and like it and listen to it whenever you wish. Goat and fish. The fish do triumph. The fish do triumph. This has been a versus of Goat vs. Fish, but in honor of all of your continuing verses,
Because the goats do
Goat vs. Fish declares a single post versus. Goat and Fish, we have entered the post verses. We have entered the post verses. A one marbleization race post verses. Fish have won the verses, but now we are in the post verses. Exclamation play to join Goat vs. Fish. Exclamation play to join Goat vs. Fish. You have 269 seconds to join the verses. We will have a one marbleization race post verses. A one marbleization race post verses. A one marbleization race post verses to see who wins the post verses. And Goat and Fish with Deb's gifted verses to Goat vs. Fish. With Deb's gifted verses to Goat vs. Fish. Goat vs. Fish now has 97 subscribers. 97 subscribers. 3 more subscriptions, and Goat vs. Fish is back at 100. 3 more, and we're back at 100, Goat and Fish. Who wants to become the next subscriber to Goat vs. Fish? Exclamation play to join Goat vs. Fish for this final verses.
This is the current verses.
This is the post verses. This is the post verses. We have Electrolab, Rain Felicia, Goat vs. Fish, and Thunder at 81. Exclamation play in the chat to join the verses. JJ Bonds has joined the verses.
Make some noise for the goat. Make some noise for the goat. This shall be a mighty verses.
Fatality has 1 marbleization, so you're letting someone else versus. Very gracious indeed, very gracious indeed. But Fatality, are you really doing it for yourself, or are you doing it for the goat or the fish? Random TV! Speaking of random TV, why don't we watch a little random TV while we're waiting for the marbleization race to begin? In celebration of fish, we give you a fish.
It says, well, I'm a shark. I'm from Australia. I have masters in creative writing and journalism. As a shark, I'm naturally on the side of Team Fish. I love eating fish. They're very delicious. Also, technically, I am a fish. But I also respect the goat side, too. They make a lot of good points. But philosophically, I'm very fish.
Celebration for fish. And Goat and Fish, the marbleization race has begun on Goat vs. Fish. Rain Man goes Fish, Rain Man goes Fish, and Electrolab immediately gets fenced. Electrolab and JJ Bonds immediately get fenced, Goat and Fish. This is not looking versus for Goat. This is not looking versus for Goat. This is not it. Goat vs. Fish. Oh, my versus Hobby Ramo. Oh, Goat vs. Fish. Thunderhead 81, you're our only versus. Treacherous versus. We're not going to let the fence win the verses. Next verses, Goat and Fish. Next, we're not going to let the fence win the verses. But you only have 69 seconds to join, Goat and Fish. You only have 69 seconds to join. Exclamation play to join the marbleization race. 69 seconds to join the verses. 69 seconds to join the verses.
The electric fence.
Random TV, appreciation your generous verses. Rainbow Magic Gems. Are you goat or are you fish? Are you goat or are you fish? Commodore Friday, welcome to Goat vs. Fish. We are in the post verses. We are in the post verses. We are in the post verses. And now everyone's joining the verses. As soon as you say 69, suddenly all the Goat and Fish go, hmm? I thought I heard something in Goat vs. Fish. Random TV, Rain Man, Autumn Samurai, Scott from Canada, Goat vs. Fish, Electrolab, Commodore Friday. Fish spin! Fish spin! Fish spin. Fish spin. Fish spin. Post verses. Are you goat? Are you fish? Are you goat or are you fish? Goat versus Fish is already 38 minuets past when we thought we would be streaming, but you have all just been so generous to Goat versus Fish. And the verses have begun. And the verses have begun. And it's one of those kinds of verses, Goat and Fish. It's one of those kinds of verses. It's one of those kinds of verses. You know this kind of verses. Hobby Remo 99. Commodore Friday, Autumn Samurai, Electropad. You need to activation the notification. Yes, Thunderhead 81. You can also join the Discord. The link is in the link tree. You can also join the Discord. You can also follow Goat vs. Fish on social media, on the Instagram or the Twitterver, where we post notifications where we are going live. Autumn Samurai, the fish. Having a bit of difficulty with that fence, having lots of difficulty with the fence. Fish getting swept aside. And this fence is not being generous to anyone. Goat versus Fish. What the versus I Rain Man? Where the fence did you come from? I Rain Man with the triumph. I Rain Man. Are you goat or are you fish? Fish power. Fish win the post versus. Fish win the post versus. Fish win the post versus. Fish win the post verses. And finally in last verses, in comes Thunderhead. I do it all for the fish. I do it all for the fish. I do it all for the fish. Fish win the post verses. The post verses is fish. Post verses goes fish. The post verses goes fish. Fish in the post verses. Post verses goes fish. And why don't we note that the pre-verse goes fish. The post-verse went fish. And the verses went fish. That's a lot of notation on Goat versus Fish, but we have to keep track of these verses. We have to keep track of these verses. I Rain Man wants to thank their mom for fish. Aww. Goat and Fish. Fish have won the verses, breaking the unification. And Fish even domination in the Prost versus. May Goat vs. Fish remind you all that we are having a Goat vs. Fish Fensoween costume contest. We want you to dress like Goat vs. Fish, or to dress like a goat or a fish, and submit your picture of you being dressed like Goat vs. Fish to Goat vs. Fish. That's GoatVsFish@gmail.com, GoatVsFish@GoatVsFish.com, or you may just send it to Goat vs. Fish on the Instagram, or post it in the Discord of Goat vs. Fish. We want your submissions. The winner of the Goat vs. Fish costume contest gets 42 versus American dollars and a shirt of Goat vs. Fish sent directly to you. 42 versus American dollars and a shirt of Goat vs. Fish if you win the Goat vs. Fish costume contest. So, prepare your Goat vs. Fish costumes. You do not even need to, Appreciation Baconopia, you do not even need to wear your Goat vs. Fish costume on Fensoween, but you still have to submit it to Goat vs. Fish. You may wear it whenever you wish. Maybe you'll find that you enjoy dressing like Goat vs. Fish. So send in your picture of you dressed in your best Goat vs. Fish, and it may be whatever your interpretation of Goat vs. Fish. There are many interpretations of Goat vs. Fish. And you could win 42 versus American dollars, 42 versus American dollars, and a shirt of Goat vs. Fish. Baconopia, Irayman, Vitality, Random TV, Autumn Samurai, Scott from Canada, Flunk Waffle, Hobby Ramo, Thunderhead 81, JJ Bonds, Autumn Samurai, Scott from Canada. We'll see you on the next verses of Goat versus Fish. Appreciation for joining Goat vs. Fish.